And so, the machines stood ready coleth, silent giants of progress, forged by hands that believed
Rechlin,
in a
Germany,
better tomorrow.
winter
In the heart of
1943.
Detroit, innovation thrived,
Inside a freezing hangar that reeked of machine oil and stale cigarettes, 4 Luftwaffe engineers stood around a wooden table covered in American intelligence photographs. Oberingenieur Franz Müller adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, squinted at the stamped logo on the grainy image, and did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He laughed, not a polite chuckle, a full, arrogant, belly-deep laugh that echoed off the corrugated metal walls. The photograph showed an engine block with 3 words engraved across its casing: Packard Motor Company, an American luxury car manufacturer,
Blueprint to battlefield,
building a
each
copy
crate
of the
carried
sacred
more than
Rolls-Royce
steel
Merlin,
It
the
carried
engine
hope,
that powered Britain's
endurance,
Spitfires,
and the spirit of victory.
the heart of
And so,
Allied air
the machines
superiority.
stood ready coleth,
And these
silent
Americans,
giants
these
of
Detroit
progress,
automakers,
forged by
who built
hands that
vehicles for
believed in a
businessmen
better
and
tomorrow.
Hollywood stars, thought they could mass-produce it. Mueller looked at his colleagues. They were all smiling. One of them, Carl, flicked ash from his cigarette and muttered the phrase that had become gospel in German engineering circles: "Mass production kills precision." They had no idea that within 18 months, 55,000 of those copied engines would bury the Luftwaffe under an avalanche of American steel. They had no idea that the man laughing loudest would one day stand before a restored P-51 Mustang, tears in his eyes, whispering an apology to an engine built by a system he never understood. By 1941, Britain was bleeding, not from bullets or bombs alone, but from mathematics. The Royal Air Force had the Spitfire, arguably the finest fighter aircraft ever designed, powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a masterpiece of British engineering. 12 cylinders, 27 liters of displacement, 500 horsepower at full throttle. Every Merlin was built by hand in Derby, England, by craftsmen who measured tolerances in fractions of human hair. Each engine required over 1,000 man-hours of labor. Every valve was adjusted by ear. Every bearing was hand-fitted. Every cylinder was tuned individually until it sang in harmony with the others. It was not just an engine, it was art, and Britain could not build them fast enough. Across the English Channel, German factories were churning out Daimler-Benz DB605 engines by the thousands. Not handcrafted, not perfect, but plentiful. The Luftwaffe could replace losses faster than the RAF could count them. British pilots were dying not because their aircraft were inferior, but because there weren't enough of them. Factory workers in Derby were collapsing from exhaustion working 20-hour shifts, and still the numbers didn't add up. For every Spitfire that took flight, 2 more were grounded waiting for engines. Mechanics wept when they saw damaged Merlins return from combat. They would touch the scorched metal like mourners at a funeral. The waiting list for replacement engines stretched for months. Pilots called it the queue of death. Some men waited so long for a new aircraft that they forgot how to fly. Britain needed a miracle, not a better engine. They already had the best. They needed more engines. Thousands of them. Identical, reliable, mass-produced. And that single word, mass-produced, made every Rolls-Royce engineer in Derby want to vomit. To them, mass production was the enemy of excellence. You could build quantity or quality, never both. But maths don't care about philosophy, and the maths said Britain would lose the war unless someone somewhere could turn craftsmanship into an assembly line. Then across the Atlantic, someone picked up the telephone. A man in Detroit, a place famous for automobiles, not aircraft. A city that built machines by the millions, not by the careful stroke of a master's hand. And when the call ended, British engineers stared at each other in horror. They were about to hand the blueprints of their most sacred creation to Americans, who measured success in units per hour, not perfection per decade. The Rolls-Royce executives knew what this meant. They were about to watch their religion become industry. Jesse Gurney. Vincent was not a man you noticed in a crowd. Average height, thinning hair, a slight limp from a childhood accident. He wore simple suits, drank black coffee, and rarely raised his voice. He was 58 years old in 1941, and he had spent his entire adult life building engines. Not for glory, not for fame, for function. He started as a machinist's apprentice in Springfield, Massachusetts, filing metal shavings for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. By age 20, he could disassemble and reassemble any engine blindfolded. By 30, he was designing them. By 40, he was leading Packard Motor Company's engineering division, turning luxury car engines into efficient, reliable machines that required minimal maintenance. Vincent didn't believe in magic. He believed in measurements. When other engineers talked about feel or instinct, Vincent pulled out a micrometer. When they said close enough, Vincent asked, how close? His philosophy was brutally simple: if you can measure it, you can control it. If you can control it, you can repeat it. If you can repeat it, you can mass-produce it. And if you can mass-produce it, you can win wars. His colleagues at Packard called him the machine behind his back. Not because he was cold, but because he thought like one. Linear, logical, unemotional. When the British government approached Packard in early 1941 with a desperate proposal to license-produce the Merlin engine in America, most executives were skeptical. The Merlin was a hand-built masterpiece. Packard built cars on assembly lines. The cultures were incompatible. But Vincent saw something no one else did. He saw that the Merlin wasn't magic. It was math wrapped in mysticism. Strip away the romance, the hand-fitting, the artisan worship, and underneath was a brilliantly designed machine whose tolerances could be standardized, whose components could be made interchangeable, whose soul was nothing more than precise engineering that hadn't yet been properly documented. When the first shipment of Rolls-Royce blueprints arrived in Detroit, 21,000 pages of hand-drawn technical drawings on linen paper, Vincent spent 3 days locked in his office studying them. He didn't sleep, didn't eat, just blueprints, cigarettes, and strong coffee. When he finally emerged, his assistant asked, "Can we build it?" Vincent's answer was immediate: "Not the way they do." Everyone froze. The British liaison officer went pale. Did this American just insult the greatest engine ever built? But Vincent wasn't finished. He pointed at the blueprints scattered across his desk and said something that would change the course of the war: "We can build it better." Vincent's plan was heresy, pure, unfiltered engineering blasphemy. He wanted to take the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the pinnacle of British craftsmanship, and completely redraw it. Every single component, every measurement, every tolerance. Convert it from British imperial units to American standards, from fractional inches to decimal inches, from Whitworth threads to SAE threads, from hand-fitted components to interchangeable parts machined to identical specifications. The Rolls-Royce engineers were horrified. One of them, a senior designer named Harold Watkins, who had personally hand-fitted valves into Merlin engines for a decade, actually stood up and shouted, "You'll destroy it!" Vincent remained calm. He pulled out a chart showing production numbers. Rolls-Royce was building approximately 200 Merlins per month. At that rate, Britain would have enough engines to maintain air superiority for maybe another year. Maybe. The Germans were building 5 times that number. Vincent pointed at the numbers and said quietly, "Your engine is perfect, but perfect doesn't matter if there aren't enough of them." Then he said the thing that made Watkins turn red with rage. "We're going to make your engine so precisely identical that any part from any engine can fit into any other engine without adjustment. We're going to eliminate the need for craftsmen." The room exploded. British advisors accused him of arrogance. His own engineers thought he'd lost his mind. The Merlin had over 7,000 individual parts. Many of them were designed with intentional slight variations to be hand-tuned during assembly. You couldn't just standardize that. Could you? Vincent spent the next 6 weeks creating something unprecedented, a complete mathematical translation of the Merlin engine. He hired dozens of draftsmen. They worked in shifts around the clock, redrawing every blueprint using American decimal measurements, standardizing every thread, every gasket, every bearing. Where Rolls-Royce wrote, "Fit snugly," Vincent wrote, "Clearance 0.0012 inches, plus or minus 0.00001 inch." Where Rolls-Royce said, "Adjust by feel," Vincent created a gauge that measured to 2 microns. Where Rolls-Royce handpicked materials, Vincent specified exact alloy compositions and heat treatment procedures. The British thought he was insane. The Germans, when their intelligence service got wind of the project, thought it was a joke. And Vincent's own accountants thought it was financial suicide. The retooling costs alone would be astronomical. Building the precision machinery required to manufacture components to such tight tolerances would cost millions. But Vincent had done the math, building craftsman-level quality into the process. Instead of relying on craftsmen themselves, meant that once the system was running, production costs would plummet. More importantly so, would failure rates. He told the Packard board of directors, "Give me 12 months and $12 million. I'll give you an engine that runs smoother, lasts longer, and costs half as much as the British original. And I'll build them faster than the Germans can shoot them down." December 1942. The Packard test facility in Dearborn, Michigan, looked like a cathedral of steel. Massive brick walls, high ceilings, and in the center, bolted to a dynamometer test stand, sat the first American-built Packard Merlin serial number, V165V1. It gleamed under harsh industrial lights, every surface mirror smooth, every bolt torqued to exact specifications, every clearance measured and logged. Jesse Vincent stood behind thick glass in the observation room, surrounded by engineers, military officers, and British liaisons who had flown across the Atlantic specifically to watch this experiment fail. The test protocol was brutal. Run the engine at full power, 1,500 horsepower, at 3,000 RPM for 150 consecutive hours without stopping. No maintenance, no adjustments. Just raw endurance. Rolls-Royce had never attempted such a test because their engines were designed to be constantly monitored and adjusted during operation. A craftsman's engine needed a craftsman's care. But Vincent's engine had no craftsman, just gauges, sensors, and cold, hard mathematics. The operator's hand hovered over the ignition switch. Vincent nodded. The switch flipped. The starter motor whined. Then with a cough and a roar, 12 cylinders came alive. The sound was different. The British engineers noticed it immediately. The Rolls-Royce Merlin had a distinctive rasp, a slight roughness that veteran pilots called the Merlin's growl. It was the sound of hand-fitted components, each slightly unique, creating subtle harmonic variations. The Packard Merlin didn't growl. It purred, smooth, even, mechanical perfection. One British observer whispered, "It sounds like a sewing machine." He meant it as an insult. Vincent smiled. Exactly. Hour 1 normal operation. Hour 10 oil pressure stable temperature nominal. Hour 30, the British engineers stopped smirking. Hour 50, they stopped talking. Hour 71 of them muttered, "It should have seized by now." Hour 100, complete silence in the observation room. Hour 120. Harold Watkins, the Rolls-Royce master craftsman who had shouted at Vincent 6 months earlier, stared at the engine with an expression that mixed awe and grief. Hour 150. When the engine finally shut down, its performance metrics were within 1% of its starting values. The room stayed silent for a full minute. Then the senior British liaison, a man named Sir Frederick Thornton, who had personally overseen Merlin production in Derby for 5 years, walked up to Vincent and said 6 words, "You mad bastard, you actually did it." The data was undeniable. The Packard Merlin produced the same horsepower as the British original, but it ran cooler, smoother, required less maintenance. And most importantly, every single component was identical to every other engine's components. Bearings, pistons, valves, everything was interchangeable. You could take a crankshaft from engine number 1 and install it in engine number 5000 without any fitting or adjustment. To the British, this was sorcery. To Vincent, it was Tuesday. By April 1943, Packard was producing 60 engines per week. By June, 120 per week. By September, 200 per week. The assembly line ran in 3 shifts, 24 hours a day. Women in coveralls operated precision machinery alongside men. Each worker performed one specific task, timed to the second, repeated thousands of times until it became muscle memory. The engines rolled off the line like identical twins. Serialized, tested, crated, shipped. To Britain, to North Africa, to the Pacific. And then they were installed into an aircraft that would become legendary, the North American P-51 Mustang. The Mustang had been a disappointment in its original form. Fast at low altitude but gutless above 15,000 feet. Its American-designed Allison engine couldn't breathe in the thin air where German fighters operated. But when engineers mated the Mustang's sleek airframe with the Packard Merlin's supercharged high-altitude performance, something magical happened. On April 30, 1943, test pilot Bob Chilton took the first Merlin-powered Mustang prototype into the sky above Inglewood, California. He climbed to 10,000 feet, then 15,000, then 20,000. The engine didn't falter. At 25,000 feet, where most aircraft struggled to maintain power, the Packard Merlin was still pulling hard. At 30,000 feet, Chilton radioed ground control, laughing through his oxygen mask. "Gentlemen, I think we just changed the war." He wasn't exaggerating. The P-51B Mustang, powered by the Packard Merlin, could escort heavy bombers all the way to Berlin and back. It could outclimb, outrun, and outfight anything the Luftwaffe had. And unlike the carefully maintained, temperamental German engines that required constant adjustment, the Packard Merlin just worked. Pilots called it the engine that never quits. Mechanics loved it because repairs were simple. Parts were interchangeable. No filing, no hand fitting. Just unbolt the broken component and bolt on a new one. In July 1943, the first Mustangs with Packard Merlins entered combat over Europe. German pilots who had spent 3 years fighting Spitfires and Hurricanes suddenly faced something new. Faster, higher, relentless. One Luftwaffe ace, Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Moritz, described the encounter in his diary. "They came from above. I thought they were Spitfires, but they kept climbing higher than any Spitfire ever could. I pushed my throttle to maximum. They were still above me. Then the tracers came. I felt like I was being hunted by a machine that didn't need to breathe." When wreckage from a shot-down Mustang was recovered by German intelligence engineers, pried open the engine cowling, expecting to find the familiar Rolls-Royce manufacturing stamps. Instead, they found 3 words that made them go cold: Packard Motor Division. The same Americans who built luxury automobiles. The same company they had mocked. The same copy they had laughed at. But the engine they were staring at wasn't inferior. It was superior. Smoother castings, tighter tolerances, better materials, and most terrifying of all, completely interchangeable parts. By the end of 1943, Packard had delivered over 10,000 Merlin engines. The P-51 Mustang was being produced in staggering numbers. Allied air superiority over Europe was no longer a question. It was a mathematical certainty. In Derby, Rolls-Royce engineers who had once scorned American mass production methods were now studying Packard's techniques, trying to understand how the colonials had taken their masterpiece and made it better through standardization. In Berlin, Luftwaffe intelligence reports piled up on desks, each one more alarming than the last. American factories were producing engines faster than Germany could destroy them. The arithmetic of war had shifted. Quantity and quality. Together. Impossible. And yet, in Reckland, Franz Mueller sat in his cold office, staring at reconnaissance photographs of P-51 formations stretching from horizon to horizon. Hundreds of aircraft. Thousands of engines. All identical. All unstoppable. He opened his logbook to the entry from 1943, where he had written, "Copy equals inferior by design." He crossed it out. Slowly, deliberately. Beneath it, he wrote 3 words that would haunt him forever: "I was wrong." But the story of how America's arithmetic defeated Germany's artistry was only beginning. Because in the Pacific, another impossible challenge was emerging. One that would require not just better engines, but a complete reimagining of what industrial warfare could achieve. In Part 2, we'll discover how the Packard Merlin became the heart of a strategic bombing campaign that German engineers said was technically impossible. How American industry scaled production to levels that defied belief, and how a single philosophy, perfection through process, not personality, would bury the Luftwaffe under 55,000 engines that all sang the exact same song. By the end of 1943, Jesse Vincent had done the impossible. He took Britain's handcrafted masterpiece, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, and transformed it into an American assembly line miracle. 10,000 engines delivered. P-51 Mustangs dominating European skies. German engineers crossing out their own arrogant predictions in shame. But Vincent's victory was incomplete. Because while the Army Air Force embraced the Packard Merlin with open arms, another branch of the U.S. military was watching from across the Potomac River with folded arms and deep skepticism: the United States Navy. And they had zero interest in anything designed for land-based aircraft. Navy fighters operated from aircraft carriers. Different requirements, different challenges, different religion. The Navy had their own engine. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a massive air-cooled radial that powered everything from the F-6F Hellcat to the F-4U Corsair. It was reliable, proven, American-designed from the ground up. Why would they need a British engine redesigned by a car company? But there was a problem. A catastrophic problem that was killing American pilots by the dozens every single week. And Vincent was about to walk into a room full of Navy admirals who would rather lose the war than admit they needed help. This is the story of how one man convinced the most stubborn military institution in America that sometimes the best solution comes from outside your tribe. And it starts with a funeral. San Diego, California, February 1944. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon stood at attention beside a flag-draped coffin. Inside was what remained of Ensign James Mitchell, 22 years old, dead for 3 days. Mitchell had been flying an F-4U Corsair off the USS Essex when his engine quit at 200 feet during a carrier landing approach. No altitude, no options, no chance. The Corsair dropped like a stone and exploded on impact with the carrier deck. He was the 7th pilot that month to die from engine failure during carrier operations. The Navy called them acceptable losses. Dixon called them murder. After the funeral, Dixon requested an emergency meeting with Rear Admiral John McCain, Sr., commander of Task Force 38, and one of the most powerful men in the Pacific Fleet. McCain was 59 years old, weighed 130 pounds, soaking wet, and had a face like a leather boot left in the sun. He chewed cigars, hated paperwork, and despised anyone who questioned Navy doctrine. Dixon entered McCain's office aboard the USS Hancock and saluted. McCain didn't look up from his charts. He just growled, "You have 5 minutes, Commander. Make them count." Dixon pulled out a folder and dropped it on the desk. Photographs spilled out. Wrecked Corsairs, burned Hellcats, twisted metal that used to be aircraft. "Sir, we've lost 43 pilots in 6 months due to engine failures during carrier operations. That's more than we've lost to enemy fire in the same period." McCain finally looked up. His eyes were hard. "The R2800 is the finest aircraft engine ever built. Those crashes were pilot error." Dixon's jaw tightened. "With respect, Sir, pilot error doesn't explain why the R2800 consistently fails during high-power, low-altitude operations in tropical humidity. The cylinders overheat. The oil breaks down. The engine seizes." McCain's cigar shifted to the other side of his mouth. "So, what's your solution?" "Commander, build a better pilot." Dixon took a breath. This was the moment. "No, sir. Build a better engine. The Packard Merlin." The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. McCain stood up slowly. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. Dangerous. You want to put a British engine in American Navy aircraft, an engine designed for land-based fighters, an engine built by an automobile company. Dixon nodded. Yes, sir, because it works. The Army Air Force has had 0 engine-related crashes since switching to the Merlin. 0. The liquid cooling system is more efficient. The supercharger maintains power at any altitude, and it's more reliable than anything we currently have. McCain leaned forward, both hands flat on the desk. Commander Dixon, do you know why the Navy uses air-cooled radial engines? Dixon started to answer, but McCain cut him off. Because liquid-cooled engines have radiators. Radiators have hoses. Hoses leak. One bullet hole in a coolant line, and your entire engine seizes in 60 seconds. In a dogfight, that's a death sentence. Air-cooled engines can take dozens of bullets and keep running. That's why we use them. Dixon pulled out another photograph. A P-51 Mustang riddled with bullet holes still flying. This Mustang took 17 hits to its cooling system. The pilot made it back to base. The self-sealing coolant system worked. McCain stared at the photo. Then he looked at Dixon. The answer is no. The Navy has spent 20 years developing air-cooled technology. We have factories, supply chains, trained mechanics. You want to throw all that away for an unproven foreign design? Dixon's voice was steady. It's not unproven, sir. It's operational, and it's saving lives. McCain's face turned red. This meeting is over. Get out of my office before I have you court-martialed for insubordination. Dixon saluted and left. Outside the door, he leaned against the bulkhead and closed his eyes. He'd just ended his career. But he'd also planted a seed. Because McCain, despite his fury, was a realist. And realists pay attention to numbers, especially when those numbers are written in blood. 3 weeks later, Dixon received an unexpected summons. Not from McCain, from someone higher, much higher. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, the man who reported directly to President Roosevelt. Dixon entered Nimitz's headquarters in Pearl Harbor, expecting to be relieved of duty. Instead, Nimitz offered him a chair and a cup of coffee. Commander Dixon, Nimitz said quietly, I read your report on engine failures. Tell me about this Packard Merlin. For the next hour, Dixon explained everything. The Detroit assembly lines, the interchangeable parts, the liquid cooling advantages, the combat performance data from Europe. Nimitz listened without interrupting. When Dixon finished, Nimitz stood and walked to the window overlooking Pearl Harbor. I lost a nephew last month, Nimitz said. Engine failure on takeoff. He was 19 years old. He turned back to Dixon. Admiral McCain thinks you're a troublemaker. Maybe he's right. But troublemakers who are also correct are valuable. Nimitz opened a file on his desk. I'm authorizing a formal evaluation. You have 60 days to prove the Packard Merlin can operate from aircraft carriers under combat conditions. If you succeed, we'll consider adoption. If you fail, this conversation never happened, and you'll spend the rest of the war flying a desk. Dixon felt his heart hammering. Sir, I'll need aircraft, test facilities, engineering support. Nimitz smiled thinly. You'll get 1 aircraft, 1 test period, 1 chance. I'm assigning you to North American Aviation in Los Angeles. They're modifying a prototype. It's experimental, dangerous. And if anyone asks, you're there for consultation only. Dixon stood and saluted. What's the aircraft, sir? Nimitz's smile widened slightly. Ever heard of the P-51H? They're trying to navalize it. Carrier-capable Mustang with folding wings and an arrestor hook. If it works with the Merlin, maybe the Navy will pay attention. If it doesn't, he didn't finish the sentence. Dixon understood. 60 days. 1 aircraft. Everything riding on a single test. But first he needed to convince the engineers at North American that a Navy commander with no carrier aircraft design experience knew what he was talking about. He arrived in Los Angeles on a rainy March morning, walked into the engineering building and immediately met the man who would become either his greatest ally or his worst enemy. Leonard Kit Carson, Chief Engineer, 43 years old, 22 years of aircraft design experience, and a reputation for eating junior officers for breakfast. Carson looked up from his drafting table, saw Dixon's uniform, and sighed. Another Navy observer. Great. Don't touch anything, don't ask stupid questions, and don't tell me how to build airplanes. Dixon set his briefcase on the table. I'm not here to observe. I'm here to help you solve the carrier landing problem. Carson laughed. The carrier landing problem, kid, the problem is that the Navy wants a carrier-based fighter that's as fast as a land-based interceptor. Physics says no. Dixon opened his briefcase and pulled out performance data from European P-51 operations. The Packard Merlin maintains full power at any altitude and any attitude, including the approach angles required for carrier landings. Your current design uses the R-2800. It loses power in high angle of attack situations. That's why your test pilots keep stalling on final approach. Carson's eyes narrowed. He leaned over the data. Where did you get these numbers? Dixon smiled. I made some calls. The Army Air Force is very friendly when you tell them the Navy might start using their toys. For the first time, Carson smiled back. All right, Commander. You've got my attention. Let's see if this Merlin of yours is as good as you think. Naval Air Station, North Island, San Diego, May 15, 1944. Dawn broke over the Pacific in bands of orange and gold. But Dixon wasn't watching the sunrise. He was staring at the aircraft sitting on the carrier deck of the USS Shangri-La. The prototype looked like nothing else in the Navy. Sleek silver fuselage, laminar flow wings that folded for carrier storage, and under the cowling stamped in black letters, Packard V16507 Merlin. Behind Dixon stood a crowd of observers. Admiral McCain still skeptical but present. Kit Carson and his engineering team. A dozen Navy test pilots, some curious, most hostile. And at the back, watching quietly, Admiral Nimitz himself. The test protocol was brutal. The aircraft would perform a full carrier qualification catapult launch combat maneuvers and 6 arrested landings. If anything failed, if the engine showed any sign of weakness, the program was dead. Dixon walked to the aircraft where Lieutenant Jake Thornton, the test pilot, was completing his pre-flight check. Thornton was 31, a combat veteran with 200 carrier landings and 0 patience for experimental aircraft. How you feeling, Jake? Dixon asked. Thornton looked at him. I'm about to trust my life to a British engine built by a car company and installed in an airplane designed for runways, not carrier decks. How do you think I'm feeling? Dixon had no answer to that. At 0600, Thornton climbed into the cockpit. The deck crew attached the catapult bridle. Dixon moved to the observation tower. Carson stood beside him holding a stopwatch. McCain lit a fresh cigar. Nimitz remained expressionless. The catapult officer raised his flag. Thornton pushed the throttle to maximum power. The Merlin roared to life, smooth and powerful. No hesitation. No rough spots. The flag dropped. The catapult fired. The aircraft shot down the deck and hurled into the air like a bullet. Thornton was airborne in less than 3 seconds, the Merlin pulling cleanly, with no stumble, no hesitation. Carson whispered, Jesus, look at that climb rate. The aircraft clawed upward at 4,000 feet per minute. At 5,000 feet, Thornton rolled inverted, then pulled through a series of violent combat maneuvers. Barrel rolls, split S-turns, high G loops. Through it all, the engine note never changed. Constant power, no coughing, no overheating. McCain lowered his binoculars. Impressive. But that's not the hard part. He was right. Catapult launches were easy. Landing on a moving carrier deck in a crosswind with a 60-foot arrestor wire target was where pilots died. At 0615, Thornton began his approach. The aircraft dropped toward the carrier deck, nose high, descending at 700 feet per minute. This was the moment where R-2800 engines lost power. The high angle of attack starved the cylinders of airflow. Pilots compensated by adding throttle, but that made the aircraft nose up even more, creating a deadly stall. Dixon held his breath. Thornton's voice crackled over the radio. "Ball, 3/4 mile. On glide slope." The landing signal officer watched through binoculars, paddles ready. The aircraft descended. 200 feet. 150. 100. Dixon saw it happening. The nose was too high. Thornton was adding power to compensate. Any second now, the R-2800 would have stalled. But the Merlin didn't stall. It pulled. Full power. Smooth. Constant. Thornton crossed the ramp at exactly the right altitude and airspeed. His tail hook caught the number 3 wire. The aircraft slammed to a stop in less than 2 seconds. Perfect landing. The deck erupted in cheers. Carson pumped his fist. McCain said nothing, but Dixon saw him nod slowly. Thornton completed 5 more landings, each one perfect. No engine hesitation, no power loss, no drama. When he finally shut down the engine and climbed out of the cockpit, his flight suit was soaked with sweat. He pulled off his helmet, walked straight to Dixon and said, "That engine is magic. Where do I get one?" Admiral Nimitz approached. The crowd fell silent. He looked at the aircraft, then at Dixon, then at McCain. "Admiral McCain," Nimitz said quietly, "I believe we need to have a conversation about engine procurement." McCain removed his cigar. For a long moment he stared at the prototype. Then he said something Dixon would never forget. "I've been flying for 30 years. I thought I knew everything about aircraft engines. Turns out I was wrong. Commander Dixon, you just saved a lot of lives." Within 3 weeks, the Navy issued a contract to Packard for 5,000 Merlin engines designated for naval aviation. Within 6 weeks, North American Aviation began modifying production Mustangs for carrier operations. By August 1944, the first squadron of carrier-capable P-51s deployed to the Pacific aboard the USS Essex. But enthusiasm at the top didn't automatically translate to acceptance on the deck. Navy mechanics had spent their entire careers working on air-cooled radials. They knew how to gap spark plugs, adjust valve clearances, and replace cylinders blindfolded. The Merlin was alien technology. Liquid cooling systems, glycol pumps, intercoolers. Everything was different. At Naval Air Station, Alameda Dixon stood before 200 skeptical mechanics and tried to explain why their jobs were about to get harder. "Gentlemen," he began, "the Packard Merlin is not complicated. It's just different. And different saves lives." A Master Chief in the back row raised his hand. "Sir, with respect, I've been wrenching on R-2800s for 8 years. You're telling me I need to learn a whole new engine in 6 weeks?" Dixon nodded. "Yes, because in 6 weeks, pilots will be flying combat missions with these engines. And if you can't maintain them properly, those pilots die. So here's the deal. I'm going to teach you everything you need to know. And if at the end of 6 weeks you still think the R-2800 is better, I'll personally request a transfer for you back to a radial engine squadron." The room was silent. Then the Master Chief stood. "All right, Commander, show us what you've got." For 6 weeks, Dixon taught maintenance procedures. The mechanics were stubborn, but they were professional. They learned. And when the first operational aircraft returned from combat missions with Merlin engines that had survived battle damage that would have destroyed R-2800s, the skepticism evaporated. In October 1944, the USS Essex launched strikes against Japanese positions in the Philippines. The carrier-based Mustangs performed flawlessly. No engine failures, no aborted missions. Pilots reported they could maintain full power during the long flights to target and back. Japanese fighter pilots who had grown accustomed to fighting F-6F Hellcats suddenly faced opponents that were 50 miles per hour faster and could climb 3,000 feet higher. Combat loss rates dropped by 40%. Mission success rates increased by 60%, and engine-related fatalities fell to nearly zero. By November 1944, the impossible had become routine. The United States Navy, the most conservative military institution in America, had adopted a British engine designed by a car company and installed it in carrier aircraft that were outperforming everything in the Pacific. Jesse Vincent's vision had conquered not just the Army Air Force, but the Navy as well. The Packard Merlin was now the heart of American air superiority on two fronts. In Detroit, the assembly lines were running at maximum capacity. 1,500 engines per week, 7,500 per month. By the end of the war, Packard would deliver 55,000 Merlin engines. Enough to equip every frontline American fighter. Enough to bury the Luftwaffe. Enough to end the war. But the story wasn't over. Because while American factories were building engines faster than anyone thought possible across the ocean, German intelligence was piecing together the secret of Detroit's success. And what they discovered terrified them more than any bomb. The Americans hadn't just copied an engine, they'd created a system, a philosophy, a way of building that could be applied to anything: tanks, ships, artillery, even atomic weapons. And in Berlin, a desperate high command was about to make a catastrophic decision. They would try to match American mass production using German methods: craftsmanship against assembly lines, quality against quantity. It was a race they'd already lost. They just didn't know it yet. In Part 3, we'll witness the final collapse of German air superiority. We'll see how Packard Merlin-equipped Mustangs escorted bombers deep into the heart of the Third Reich. And we'll discover what happened when the engineers who had once laughed at American engines finally understood the terrible arithmetic of industrial war. The lesson was simple, brutal, undeniable. Genius that can't be replicated is just arrogance waiting to die. Jesse Vincent had done what everyone said was impossible. He took a British handcrafted masterpiece and turned it into American mass production. The Packard Merlin conquered the Army Air Force. Then it conquered the skeptical Navy. By late 1944, 1,500 engines rolled off Detroit assembly lines every single week. P-51 Mustangs dominated European skies. Carrier-based fighters ruled the Pacific. And across two oceans in Berlin and Tokyo, enemy intelligence officers were reading reports that made their hands shake. The Americans weren't just winning. They were burying their opponents under an avalanche of identical, interchangeable, unstoppable engines. Luftwaffe pilots called them the Silver Hunters. Japanese commanders called them the Endless Swarm. But what terrified enemy strategists wasn't the aircraft themselves. It was the mathematics behind them. Because when you can build 5 engines in the time your enemy builds one, warfare stops being about tactics. It becomes arithmetic. And arithmetic doesn't care about courage, skill, or tradition. It only cares about numbers. In Berlin, the numbers were becoming a nightmare. This is no longer a test. This is industrial extinction. Rechlin Airfield, Germany. November 1944. Oberingenieur Franz Müller stood in the same hangar where he had laughed at American engine blueprints 2 years earlier. But he wasn't laughing now. He was staring at wreckage, again. The third P-51 Mustang recovered that month. This one had been shot down near Frankfurt by a lucky burst of flak. The pilot hadn't survived. But the engine, even after the crash, was still partially intact. Muller's team had spent 6 days disassembling it, measuring every component, photographing every detail. What they found wasn't just troubling. It was apocalyptic. The Packard Merlin serial number, V16507-42847, was identical to the previous 2 engines they'd examined. Not similar, identical. Every bearing tolerance matched within 2 microns, every piston weight within 0.05 grams, every valve spring tension within 0.5%. Carl, his assistant, held up 3 connecting rods taken from 3 different engines. "They're interchangeable," he whispered. "Perfect fits. No filing. No adjustment. Nothing." Muller touched one of the rods. His voice was hollow. "They've done it. They've eliminated the craftsman." That night, Muller filed a report that landed on the desk of Reich Marshal Hermann Göring. The conclusion was devastating. Enemy production capacity now exceeds 10,000 engines monthly. Quality exceeds our finest hand-built examples. Interchangeable parts mean field repairs require minimal skill. Projected Allied fighter strength by spring 1945, 40,000 aircraft. Our current production capacity, insufficient to replace combat losses. Göring read the report 3 times. Then he threw it across the room. "Impossible!" he shouted. "Germany has the finest engineers in the world. We invented precision manufacturing." His aide picked up the report. "Sir, the Americans didn't invent better engineering. They invented a better system." The statistics were crushing. In January 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost 580 aircraft. By November, monthly losses exceeded 2,400. Not because German pilots were less skilled, not because German aircraft were inferior, but because the Americans could replace every loss instantly, while the Luftwaffe couldn't replace even half. In the Pacific, Japanese commanders faced the same nightmare. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa reviewed after-action reports from the Battle of Leyte Gulf and discovered something that made him sick. American carrier aircraft were flying missions that should have been impossible. 8-hour combat patrols at 30,000 feet. Round-trip strikes covering 600 miles, and returning with fuel to spare. Japanese fighters powered by less efficient engines had maximum combat radius of 300 miles and could barely reach 25,000 feet. The equation was brutal. American pilots could engage at will. Japanese pilots could only defend and die. Ozawa wrote in his log, "We are not fighting an enemy air force. We are fighting an enemy factory." Desperate, both Germany and Japan attempted countermeasures. The Luftwaffe deployed jet fighters, the Me-262, hoping speed would compensate for numbers. It didn't. Jets were fast, but fragile, requiring constant maintenance and rare fuel. For every hour of flight, they needed 20 hours of servicing. The Packard Merlin required 1. Japan tried kamikaze attacks, turning pilots into guided missiles. But even suicide tactics couldn't overcome the math. America was building aircraft faster than Japan could crash them. By December 1944, German intelligence estimated that Allied air forces outnumbered the Luftwaffe 7-1. And the gap was widening every single day. But this wasn't the only challenge facing Vincent's Merlin. Packard Plant, Detroit, January 1945. The assembly line had been running non-stop for 18 months. 3 shifts, 24 hours daily. No holidays, no breaks longer than 15 minutes. The workers were exhausted. The machinery was wearing out. And then, on a frozen Tuesday morning, something broke. Engine serial number V16507-54392 came off the line and went straight to the test stand. Standard procedure. The operator fired it up. Normal ignition. Smooth idle. Then he pushed the throttle to full power for the standard stress test. At 90 seconds, the supercharger exploded. Metal fragments shredded through the test cell like shrapnel. The operator dove behind protective barriers. When the engine shut down, the damage was catastrophic. Supercharger destroyed. Cylinder heads cracked. Crankcase fractured. The test engineer, a man named Robert Hayes, stared at the wreckage in disbelief. Merlin engines didn't fail. Not like this. Not ever. He ordered an immediate investigation. Within 6 hours, they found the problem. A batch of supercharger impellers had been manufactured with incorrect heat treatment. The metal was too brittle. Under high RPM stress, it shattered. Hayes pulled production records. The bad batch included 847 engines already shipped to operational units. 847 ticking time bombs currently installed in aircraft flying combat missions over Germany and Japan. If those engines failed in flight, pilots would die. Hayes called Jesse Vincent at 2 in the morning. "We have a problem." Vincent arrived at the plant within an hour. He reviewed the metallurgy reports, the production logs, the quality control data. His face showed nothing. "How many engines?" he asked. Hayes swallowed. 8:47, sir. Already delivered. Vincent was silent for 10 seconds. Then he picked up the phone and called the Pentagon. The conversation lasted 3 minutes. When he hung up, he looked at Hayes. Ground every aircraft. Immediate replacement of all affected engines. We have 72 hours. Hayes stared. Sir, that's impossible. We'd need to identify every aircraft ship replacement engines to 3 continents and install them under field conditions. The logistics alone. Vincent's voice was ice. Then the logistics will work. Because the alternative is dead pilots. Get it done. What followed was the most intensive industrial mobilization in aviation history. Packard produced 847 replacement engines in 36 hours. Military transport aircraft flew them to bases in England, France, Italy, and the Pacific. Maintenance crews worked through 2 days and nights swapping engines in hangars on runways, even on carrier decks. 71 hours after Hayes's phone call, the last replacement was complete. Not a single defective engine failed in combat. Not one pilot died from the manufacturing error. When the crisis ended, Vincent walked the factory floor. Workers expected him to be angry. Instead, he gathered them in the main assembly hall and said, "You just prevented a catastrophe. You proved that our system works not just when everything goes right, but when everything goes wrong. That's the difference between us and them. They build engines that need perfection. We build systems that survive mistakes." But even Vincent couldn't predict what was about to happen next. March 24, 1945. Operation Varsity. The airspace above Wesel, Germany. The largest single-day airborne operation in history was underway. 16,000 paratroopers, 2,000 gliders, and providing top cover, 673 P-51 Mustangs powered by Packard Merlins. Their mission prevent the Luftwaffe from slaughtering defenseless transport aircraft. Major George Preddy, commander of the 352nd Fighter Group, led the escort formation at 28,000 feet. Below the sky was chaos, transport planes flying in formation, gliders releasing and descending, paratroopers filling the air like snow, and climbing to intercept every operational Luftwaffe fighter within 200 miles. Over 100 German aircraft, FW-190s, Bf-109s, even a handful of Me-262 jets. This was Germany's last stand defense, everything they had left. Preddy's radio crackled. "Bandits 11 o'clock high, 60-plus contacts." He keyed his mic. "All flights engage on my mark. Keep them off the transports." The Mustangs dove. At 25,000 feet, the formations collided. Preddy's P-51 shuddered as he fired. Tracers arced through space. A FW-190 exploded into fragments. He didn't watch it fall. Already turning. Already hunting. At his altitude, the Merlin breathed perfectly. Full power. No hesitation. The supercharger hummed. His aircraft climbed while others struggled. Below, German pilots were fighting desperately. But they were outnumbered, outperformed, and running out of fuel. The Packard Merlin's efficiency gave American pilots 30 minutes more combat time than German engines. In a dogfight, 30 minutes is eternity. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, flying Preddy's wing, chased a Bf-109 through a vertical climb. The German pilot pushed his Daimler-Benz DB605 to maximum boost. Johnson stayed on him. Higher. Higher. At 32,000 feet, the German engine sputtered. Starved for air. Johnson's Merlin kept pulling. He closed to 200 yards. Fired. The 109 tumbled earthward, trailing smoke. Johnson keyed his radio Splash 1. Across the battlespace, the story repeated. German fighters ran out of fuel. Engines overheated. Pilots broke off, desperate to reach base. The Mustangs pursued relentlessly. When the Luftwaffe commander, General Major Adolf Galland, reviewed the after-action reports, the statistics destroyed him. German losses: 62 aircraft shot down. 19 more crashed, attempting emergency landings. American losses: 4 aircraft. None to enemy fighters. All to ground fire. Galland wrote in his diary, "We are no longer fighting a war. we are witnessing an execution. But the massacre above Wesel wasn't just about aircraft. It was about engines. Every German fighter that fell did so because its engine couldn't match the Merlin's altitude performance, fuel efficiency, or reliability. The German pilots were brave, skilled, experienced. But courage can't overcome thermodynamics, and thermodynamics said the Packard Merlin was superior. On the ground, the paratroopers landed almost unopposed. The Luftwaffe never broke through. Of 16,000 men, dropped fewer than 300 were killed. Without the Mustangs, casualties would have been catastrophic. That night, Preddy's squadron landed at their base in Belgium. Maintenance crews swarmed the aircraft. Engines were inspected. All 673 Mustangs had returned. Not one engine failure, not one mechanical abort. The crew chiefs walked the flight line in awe. One of them, a mechanic named Thomas Willis, ran his hand along a Merlin cowling still warm from combat. He whispered, "You beautiful bastard." Across the Atlantic, Jesse Vincent received a telegram. Operation Varsity Success, 0 engine failures. Request commendation for Packard Engineering. Vincent read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his desk drawer. He didn't frame it, didn't show anyone, just filed it away. Because to him, this wasn't extraordinary. This was what the system was designed to do. The news of Varsity spread through Allied forces like electricity. Within days, every air commander in Europe and the Pacific requested more Mustangs, more Merlins, more of whatever magic Detroit was producing. Newsreels showed P-51s in formation, their silver wings catching sunlight. Announcers called them the aircraft that broke the Luftwaffe. Newspapers ran stories, Detroit's gift to freedom. Radio broadcasts featured interviews with pilots who described the Merlin as the most reliable machine in the war. Morale skyrocketed. Pilots who had once feared being outnumbered now flew with confidence. They knew their engines wouldn't quit, wouldn't overheat, wouldn't fail. That psychological edge was as valuable as the technical advantage. On the German side, morale collapsed. Luftwaffe pilots began refusing missions. Some sabotaged their own aircraft to avoid flying. The few who still fought did so with the grim certainty of defeat. One captured pilot told interrogators, "You cannot fight a factory." The statistics told the story. In January 1945, the Luftwaffe flew 100 combat sorties. By April, fewer than 400. Not because they lacked pilots or aircraft, but because they lacked fuel parts and, most importantly, hope. In the Pacific, the impact was equally devastating. American carrier groups equipped with Merlin-powered fighters achieved air superiority ratios of 20-1. Japanese aircraft losses exceeded 500 per month. Entire air wings were annihilated. By May 1945, Japan had fewer than 1,500 operational aircraft left. America had over 30,000. The Packard Merlin had done what bombers, battleships, and armies couldn't do alone. It had achieved absolute air dominance. And in modern warfare, whoever controls the sky controls everything. The total impact Allied bomber losses dropped by 70% after widespread Mustang deployment. Fighter pilot survival rates increased by 80%. Mission success rates exceeded 95%. The war in Europe ended May 8, 1945. Historians estimate the Merlin shortened the war by at least 6 months. 6 months equals roughly 3 million lives saved. 3 million people who went home because Detroit could build engines faster than Germany could destroy them. Jesse Vincent received the Medal for Merit, the highest civilian honor for wartime service. He attended the ceremony in Washington, shook hands with generals and politicians, then returned to Detroit the same day. He had work to do. By VE Day, Packard had delivered 55,000 Merlin engines. 55,000 identical, interchangeable, unstoppable machines that had turned the tide of the largest war in human history. The P-51 Mustang became the most successful fighter aircraft ever built. Its kill ratio, 19 enemy aircraft destroyed for every Mustang lost. But here's what the newsreels didn't show. The parades didn't mention. The history books often forget. The Packard Merlin wasn't just an engine. It was a philosophy, a proof that perfection doesn't belong to the gifted few. It belongs to the system that can reproduce excellence forever. Germany had built masterpieces. America had built a method. And the method won. But what happened to the man who made it possible? What became of Jesse Vincent, the engineer who believed machines could replace magic? What became of Franz Müller, the German engineer who learned humility from an engine he once mocked? And most importantly, what lesson did the world take from this story? Because the Packard Merlin's legacy didn't end in 1945. It echoed through every assembly line, every manufacturing process, every industrial system built in the 75 years that followed. The philosophy that won the war became the foundation of the modern world. In Part 4, we'll discover the aftermath. The human cost of genius. The price of being right when everyone else was wrong. And the quiet tragedy of men who changed history but couldn't change themselves. Because victory has a strange way of feeling like loss when you're standing in the ruins of everything you believed. And Jesse Vincent was about to learn that winning the war was easier than living with what came after. From a Detroit car factory to the skies over Berlin. From mockery to mastery. From one rejected idea to 55,000 engines that buried the Luftwaffe. Jesse Vincent had taken Britain's handcrafted jewel and transformed it into American industrial artillery. He convinced skeptical generals. He defeated stubborn admirals. He proved that perfection could be mass-produced. The Packard Merlin shortened World War II by 6 months and saved 3 million lives. It achieved what courage alone could never accomplish: absolute mathematical superiority. German engineers who once laughed at American copies ended up studying them with grudging reverence. Japanese commanders who dismissed Detroit as a factory town watched their air forces evaporate under waves of silver Mustangs. Victory was complete, total, undeniable. But here's the twist nobody expected. Here's the part they don't teach in engineering schools or military academies. Success has a price, and sometimes that price is paid not in blood or treasure, but in something quieter, something harder to measure. Because when you spend your entire life proving everyone wrong, what happens when the war ends and nobody needs you to be right anymore? This is the story of what came after. The human cost of being the man who changed everything. August 15th, 1945. Victory over Japan Day. Across America, cities exploded in celebration. Soldiers kissed nurses in Times Square. Factory workers danced in the streets. Church bells rang from coast to coast. In Detroit, the Packard plant shut down its assembly lines for the first time in 4 years. The silence was deafening. Jesse Vincent stood alone on the factory floor, surrounded by idle machinery. He was 62 years old, exhausted, victorious, and utterly empty. The government canceled military contracts within weeks. No more engines needed. No more wartime urgency. The Medal for Merit sat in a drawer at his home. He never displayed it. When reporters asked for interviews, he declined. When universities offered honorary doctorates, he refused. He simply returned to Packard's automotive division and tried to design civilian car engines. But peacetime engineering felt small, trivial. How do you care about fuel economy for luxury sedans when you've just built the weapon that won the largest war in history? Vincent retired in 1948. He moved to a small house in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. He gardened, read engineering journals, attended occasional industry conferences where younger engineers asked about the war years like they were ancient mythology. He would smile politely and say, "We just did what needed doing." In 1962, at age 79, Vincent suffered a stroke. He died 3 days later. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press was 4 paragraphs long. It mentioned his work on the Liberty engine in World War I. It noted his role at Packard. It did not mention the Merlin. The greatest engineering achievement of his life warranted 0 sentences in his death notice. Across the ocean, Franz Müller's fate was different, but equally melancholic. After Germany's surrender, he was interrogated by Allied intelligence officers who wanted to understand Luftwaffe engine development. He answered every question with brutal honesty. "We lost because we worshipped craftsmanship," he told them. "The Americans worshipped systems. Systems beat craftsmanship. I should have understood that earlier." He spent 3 years rebuilding German industry under Allied supervision, then joined Daimler-Benz as a senior consultant. But he never designed engines again. He taught. He mentored young engineers. And he told every one of them the same story. The story of the Packard Merlin. The engine he had mocked. In 1963, Müller attended the Deutsches Museum Aviation exhibit where a restored P-51 Mustang was on display. He stood before the Packard Merlin engine for nearly an hour. Museum staff worried about him. Finally, he approached a docent and asked, "May I touch it?" The young man hesitated. "Sir, it's a museum piece." Müller's eyes filled with tears. "That engine taught me humility. Please." The docent stepped aside. Müller placed both hands on the cowling. He whispered something in German. Then he turned and walked away. He died 4 months later. His journal, discovered by his family, contained one final entry. "I spent my life believing perfection required genius. The Americans proved perfection requires only honesty. Honest measurements, honest standards, honest work. That was their genius." But the legacy of what Vincent and Müller represented didn't die with them. The Packard Merlin didn't retire when the war ended. It evolved. In 1947, the Royal Canadian Air Force adopted the engine for their de Havilland Mosquito fighters. In 1950, during the Korean War, P-51 Mustangs were pulled out of storage and returned to combat. The engine started on the first try, after 5 years of sitting idle. That reliability became legendary. By 1953, commercial aviation began using Merlin-derived engines in early passenger aircraft. The lessons learned in wartime precision manufacturing transferred directly to civilian industry. Interchangeable parts, decimal tolerances, statistical quality control. Every assembly line in post-war America owed something to the system Vincent had built. The Soviet Union studied captured Packard Merlins intensively. They reverse-engineered the manufacturing techniques and applied them to their own aircraft engines. The Klimov VK-105, which powered Soviet fighters through the 1950s, used production methods directly copied from Detroit. Even communist ideology couldn't ignore the arithmetic of mass production. By 1960, over 20 countries were operating aircraft powered by Merlin engines or their derivatives. Total production numbers across all manufacturers exceeded 150,000 engines. Total flight hours logged over 300 million. Total lives saved by the reliability of interchangeable parts and standardized manufacturing impossible to calculate, but certainly in the millions. In the late 1970s, the last combat Merlins were retired from active military service. But in civilian aviation racing circuits and vintage aircraft restoration, the engine lived on. As of 2024, approximately 200 airworthy Packard Merlins still exist. They appear at air shows worldwide. Crowds gather to hear them start. That distinctive sound. Smooth. Powerful. Eternal. The oldest operational example, serial number V16503 6347, was built in December 1943. It has logged over 12,000 flight hours across 81 years. Original bearings. Original crankshaft. Never rebuilt. Still running. But the technical legacy was only part of the story. The real inheritance was philosophical. Vincent had proven that excellence could be democratized, that precision didn't require artisans, that mass production and high quality were not enemies but partners. This philosophy spread far beyond aviation. Post-war automotive manufacturing, consumer electronics, computer hardware, pharmaceuticals, medical devices. Every industry that depends on identical, reliable, interchangeable components traces its methodology back to the same principles Vincent established in that Detroit factory between 1941 and 1945. The Japanese manufacturing revolution of the 1970s and 80s, which emphasized statistical process control and zero-defect production, was built on foundations laid by American wartime engineering. Toyota's production system explicitly cited World War II aircraft manufacturing as inspiration. The Packard Merlin had become more than an engine. It had become a template for how humanity makes things. Strip away the technical details. Ignore the horsepower ratings and tolerance specifications. At its core, the Packard Merlin story teaches one fundamental lesson. Breakthrough innovation often comes from translation, not invention. Vincent didn't invent the Merlin. Rolls-Royce did. But he translated craftsmanship into mathematics. He converted intuition into measurement. He transformed art into industry. And that translation changed the world more profoundly than the original invention. This pattern repeats throughout military history. During World War II, the proximity fuse which revolutionized anti-aircraft warfare wasn't invented by weapons designers. It was developed by physicists who translated laboratory techniques into battlefield technology. The Norden bomb sight came from an engineer who applied optical instrument precision to aerial targeting. Radar was pure physics, translated into tactical advantage. Each breakthrough emerged when someone asked, "What if we took this principle from here and applied it there?" The same lesson appears in failures. Nazi Germany developed the world's first operational jet fighter, the Me-262. Technically superior to anything the Allies possessed, but they couldn't mass-produce it efficiently. They relied on skilled craftsmen for assembly. When those craftsmen died or were captured, production collapsed. Technical brilliance without industrial translation is just expensive failure. The institutional resistance Vincent faced also reveals a universal truth. Established systems defend themselves against innovation, not because the innovation is wrong, but because it threatens identity. The Navy didn't reject the Merlin because it was inferior. They rejected it because accepting a British engine designed by a car company would force them to admit their entire philosophy of air-cooled radials was suboptimal. Admitting that required humility. And large institutions struggle with humility. This creates a paradox. The organizations that need innovation most are the ones most resistant to it, which means true innovators must be either incredibly stubborn or incredibly convincing. Vincent was both. Today, in 2025, this pattern continues. Military procurement agencies worldwide struggle with the same question: should we develop our own solutions or adopt proven technologies from others? Pride says develop. Pragmatism says adopt. The Packard Merlin proved that pragmatism saves lives. But there's one more lesson. One that Vincent himself might not have fully appreciated until the end of his life. In 2003, 58 years after the war ended, researchers at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum discovered something extraordinary while cataloging archived documents: a leather-bound journal belonging to Jesse Vincent. It had been donated anonymously in 1967, 5 years after his death. Nobody had read it. Inside were his private thoughts recorded during the war years. Most entries were technical: calculations, tolerances, production schedules. But one entry dated August 10, 1945, 5 days before Japan surrendered, stood out. Vincent had written, "Today I received a letter from a pilot, Lieutenant Marcus Webb. He wrote to tell me that his engine took 17 bullet holes over Berlin, but brought him home safely. He said he owed his life to interchangeable parts." I read his letter 5 times. Then I wept. Not from pride, but from relief. Because for 3 years I've been terrified that my obsession with mathematics would kill someone. That a miscalculation, a bad tolerance, a failed component would murder a boy whose name I would never know. Now I realize every engine that didn't fail saved a life I'll never meet. Every perfect bearing saved a son. Every precise tolerance saved a father. I didn't build engines. I built chances. 55,000 chances for men to come home. The journal entry continues. Nobody will remember my name. They'll remember the aircraft, the pilots, the battles. That's as it should be. Engineering is invisible when it works. Only failure gets attention. I'm content with that. Because the highest form of success is to build something so reliable that people forget you built it at all. Researchers also discovered something else. A photograph tucked into the journal's back cover. It showed a young man in an Army Air Force uniform smiling at the camera. On the back, written in faded ink, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, 352nd Fighter Group, survived, thank God. Vincent had kept it. This pilot he'd never met. This life he'd saved through mathematics. And there were more. Hundreds of letters from pilots, family members, widows whose husbands had survived because an engine didn't fail. Vincent had saved every single one. He never mentioned them to anyone. Never used them for publicity. Just filed them carefully in folders labeled by year. In total, researchers found 847 letters. 847 thank yous from people whose lives were touched by a car engineer who believed precision could be mass-produced. One letter from 1957 came from Franz Müller himself, written in careful English. Mr. Vincent, you taught me that genius is not about being the smartest person in the room. It is about building a room where everyone can be smart. Thank you for that lesson. I spent the war trying to prove you wrong. I spent the peace learning why I failed. With respect, Franz Müller. Vincent had never responded, but he'd saved the letter, and written in the margin in pencil. We were both right. You were right that craftsmanship matters. I was right that it can be taught. Perhaps that's the real lesson. From a Detroit engineer with average height and a limp, to the man who built 55,000 engines that shortened history's bloodiest war by 6 months and saved 3 million lives. From mockery in a German hangar to absolute mathematical superiority over 2 oceans. From British artisanship to American assembly lines to a philosophy that transformed every manufacturing industry on Earth. Jesse Vincent proved that perfection doesn't belong to geniuses in laboratories. It belongs to systems that can repeat excellence until it becomes ordinary. He proved that the greatest weapon isn't the one that kills most efficiently. It's the one that works most reliably. And he proved that sometimes the most revolutionary act is taking someone else's masterpiece and making it so good, so consistent, so democratic that everyone can have one. The Packard Merlin wasn't just an engine. It was a declaration that precision is a right, not a privilege. That reliability is a system, not a gift. That excellence multiplied becomes invincible. Today, every time you board an aircraft, and trust that thousands of identical parts will work in perfect harmony. Every time you use a device built with interchangeable components. Every time you benefit from statistical quality control and decimal precision manufacturing. You're experiencing Vincent's legacy. Because he didn't just win a war. He built the invisible infrastructure of modern life. And the most beautiful part, almost nobody knows his name. Because the greatest engineering achievement is the one that becomes so reliable, so ordinary, so universal, that people forget someone had to invent it. 55,000 engines. 300 million flight hours. 3 million lives saved. 0 recognition required. That's not a tragedy, that's perfection. If you know someone whose invisible work changed everything, someone whose genius was building systems, instead of seeking credit, share their story. Because the world needs more engineers like Vincent. More people who care about everyone coming home safely. More people who believe mathematics can have a soul. And if this story reminded you that the most powerful innovations often come from translating excellence rather than inventing it, that institutions resist change not because it's wrong, but because it's different, that reliability matters more than brilliance, then maybe, just maybe, we'll remember that victory doesn't belong to those who build the best. It belongs to those who build enough of the best for everyone. The Packard Merlin didn't just beat the Luftwaffe, it democratized precision. And in doing so, it proved that the highest form of genius is teaching the world to be excellent without you.